Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today we are talking about one of my all-time favorite authors, dare I say my favorite author, which this is a horror book channel, so that's pretty cliche, but Stephen King. I don't think you can read horror without having at least read one Stephen King book and understanding how basically the father of contemporary horror writes. I adore his work. I've read a plethora of his novels, not all of them, but hopefully one day I will get there. But definitely one of the books that I feel like is talked about pretty frequently is Pet Sematary. It's up there with Carrie, The Shining, It, all of like his big masterpieces, I would say. But Pet Sematary is a book that I've always kind of had a love-hate relationship with. It was the book that it was one of the earlier Stephen King books I read. I started with Carrie and then read Misery and Salem's Lot, and then I believe number 4 was Pet Sematary. I don't remember what I would have like rated it, because when I read it I wasn't really using Goodreads and rating books. Probably somewhere around a 3-star read, because I remember being really into the writing and then really hating like the climax and the end of the book. But I did read it when I was about 21 years old, so 9 years ago. So when I recently received the Pet Sematary Down the Rabbit Hole book box limited edition set, I had to think, and I was like, you know what, I think I probably need to revisit this novel. Especially because there's so many film adaptations. There's the newest film adaptation, Bloodlines, which is about like a side story in the original book. And so many people love this book. And I feel like I really need to go back with a new, older perspective when reading it, because one of the big things that I hear the most about Pet Sematary is that you probably need to be decently into adulthood to really appreciate the horror. When I read it, I was just out of college, and would have had no real grasp on what it is like for a parent to lose a child. I don't have kids now, I just have a dog. But I feel like from an older perspective, and now that I have friends who have kids, I can maybe understand this book a little bit better. So today I'm going to talk about whether I think reading Pet Sematary is worth it or not. I never try to discourage anybody from reading books. My channel is just for you guys to have my own critical opinion. So when I do these like should you read videos, at the end I'm not going to say yes or no. I'm going to let you guys decide. I've only done this type of video once before, and that was for House of Leaves. I actually think it's my most viewed video on YouTube, so if you haven't seen it, check it out. That is a whirlwind of a book. But yes, let's chat about Pet Sematary. Just in case you live under a horror-lit rock, I will read the inside flap for you guys. As King says in his introduction, when I'm asked what I consider to be the most frightening book I've ever written, the answer I give comes easily and with no hesitation. Pet Sematary. When Dr. Lewis Creed takes a job and moves his family to the idyllic rural town of Ludlow, Maine, this new beginning seems too good to be true. Yet despite Ludlow's tranquility, an undercurrent of danger exists here. Those trucks on the road outside the Creeds' beautiful old home travel by just a little too quickly, for one thing, as is evidenced by the makeshift pet cemetery in the nearby woods. Then there are the warnings to Lewis, both real and from the depths of his nightmares, that he should not venture beyond the borders of this little graveyard. A blood-chilling truth is hidden there, one more terrifying than death itself, and hideously more powerful. An ominous fate befalls anyone who dares to tamper with this forbidden place, as Lewis is about to discover for himself. As the story unfolds, so does a nightmare of the supernatural, one so relentless you might not want to continue reading, but will be unable to stop. There's a reason King put this novel in a drawer for several years, thinking, I had finally gone too far. So that's one of the things that intrigues me the most about this novel. We have this master of horror who wrote this novel back in mid-1979. It did not get published until 1983 because he was too, I guess scared to release it. He thought he had gone too far, that it was going to be too extreme. His wife read it, thought it was definitely worth publishing, so in 1983 it hit shelves. And I'm fascinated by it, because to me one of the things that I think is so scary about horror lit is when you have supernatural elements that are frightening and not of this world and probably aren't going to take shape in reality, and you compare them to very realistic things that do happen, that can happen every single day. And King has such a great way of making both this like supernatural moments pale in comparison to what can happen in reality, and kind of give you this undertone that, hey, sometimes the real world is much, much worse than the fantasy. And I think one of the reasons he would admit that this is the scariest book he has ever written is because the kind of basic premise of the novel almost happened to him. Back in 1979, just like Louis Creed, King did take a teaching role at the University of Maine, I believe. They did live in a rental right across from a really, really busy road. And I believe, I read differently. I read that his daughter's cat did get run over by a vehicle, but I've also read that his son, I believe Owen, not Joe, did almost run into the road and also almost get hit by a truck before. I believe that was in the original introduction to my paperback copy. And that's what inspired him to write it, was his own fear of what if I hadn't caught up to my son. And I think for King, writing this was definitely some sort of therapeutic exercise, but it was also very much rooted in his own sense of dread and reality, which therefore would make it terrifying to him. And any parent who has potentially experienced something similar, like the loss of a child, is definitely going to be able to resonate with that. And I love how this novel starts with the loss of a pet and then amps it up to the loss of a child and shows the dichotomy there. If you haven't read Pet Sematary, and I imagine many of you haven't since you're watching this video, the basic premise of this story is kind of what this story is kind of what the back of the book says. But what's important to know is that it involves what would you do if a child died and to what lengths would you go to bring that child back. That is the core root of this story, and that is what I think makes it so terrifying to an extent. But you do need to be prepared for the fact that there is animal death. There is very tragic loss of a child. Actually, several people in this book. It is Stephen King. So just something to be aware of going into it. It isn't a fleeting thing. It is the absolute pinnacle focus of this entire novel. So definitely something to just be prepared for when you go into it. So here we have let's see, my copy is about 400 pages, I would say. I'd say, depending on the size of your book, it's going to be anywhere between like 350 and 400 pages. And it has been adapted into 2 films with 2 spin-off films, 1 spin-off each coming from its respective titular film. We have the original one in 1989, which the screenplay was written by Stephen King. That one's really well done. It's very scary. It's got great cheesy 1970s special effects. And Herman Munster, his actor's name is escaping me, does play Judd Crandall. He's great. There's a whole South Park episode that makes fun of him. Fred Gwynne, how could I forget that? And then of course there's the 2019 one, which really alters the original story. Instead of focusing on the death of the youngest child, the book does focus on the death of a slightly older child, primarily done to not put the type of strain and stress that the original movie put on the younger child. They were just kind of worried about that in today's age. I don't necessarily love the 2019 film. It's interesting to watch, and I am planning on watching Bloodlines, primarily because it is the story of, Timmy Bannerman, which is a really interesting side story in the original novel. I'm going to get to that in a second. But I would love to see that adapted on screen because it is a really scary sequence in the book. But they keep making movies about this, so obviously there are a lot of people out there who really do love this story. Another thing that I think is really interesting about this book is Stephen King loves to pay homage to the Gothic lit greats that came before him. You have books like Revival, which is really just his spin on Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. You have Salem's Lot, which is his vampire story, obviously Bram Stoker's Dracula. This, however, and I never realized this until I actually recently read about it, is his spin on W.W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw. I believe Rat in If It Bleeds, I think that was the book, or I think that was the short story, is also kind of a retelling of The Monkey's Paw. It's a very interesting concept, and if you haven't read it, I do highly recommend it. It's a very quick and easy and scary read. But it is kind of the idea of at what lengths would you go to bring back a child who has predeceased you. And I think King does a really, really great job of taking such a dark, kind of well-known concept in the Gothic lit sphere and making it entirely his own. The same can be said with Revival. The same can be said with Salem's Lot. He's very, very good at crafting his own narrative, even if he is directly inspired by something else. And however, I do think that you can see that The Monkey's Paw is definitely a story that I feel like he really loves and treasures, and he did such a great job of recreating that narrative without outright copying it or making it feel like any kind of just regurgitation. This is a very unique, very different, very long, and distinctive story. I think one of the things that makes this book so interesting is questioning of morality within our main characters. Obviously, you have Ellie and Gage, the two children, who are just innocents within the story, as well as Church, the cat. Even though they all become large players at some point in the story, their morality we aren't really questioning. But when we look at characters like Lewis and Rachel and Judd, there are so many layers to pull back there. Rachel, who was haunted by her past with her sister Zelda. You have Lewis, who is going to see how he can deal with the corruptive and evil forces that are plaguing him and his family. And then you have Judd, and I always found Judd the most interesting character in this novel, and I wish I had known this concept going into the book when I was reading it. But you have to ask yourself, is Judd Crandall a good guy? Because on the pages, he really seems to have good intentions and to come from a good place, but his actions speak far louder than his kind and neighborly words. And I've always wondered why he introduced Louis Creed to the Pet Sematary, why he kind of put the idea in his head, why he continues to kind of guide Louis into this kind of terrible horror story that unravels with this novel. And I just think that when you go into reading this, it's a really fun question to ask yourself from the very, very beginning. Is Judd Crandall evil? Has he also been corrupted by the forces that control the Pet Sematary? And I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. I think it's something that you can just kind of read throughout the book as you're going. Like I said, one of my goals for this year is I definitely want to reread Pet Sematary, especially with all of these things in mind. I'm kind of looking at it like rewatching a very sophisticated horror movie where you start to pick up on things and you can start to pull back pieces because you know the twist at the end. So that's definitely one of the things that I would love to look at when it comes to Judd Crandall and his whole role with the cemetery. One of the things I have to say is that I do find this book to be scary. One of my largest complaints with this novel is I felt that the ending was very, very, very rushed. I felt that there was so much buildup for a short climax and then a very brief conclusion, and it's a very, very dark conclusion. But I just remember closing the book and being like, that's it. And normally when I'm reading like a 400-page book, getting to the end, you're like, oh my god, I finished it. For Stephen King, I know that he can write 1,100-page books and I'm going to read them. So I just always felt that the ending was really, really rushed, which makes me think that maybe I was missing something. But I think another thing is that you get to this climax and it's not as terrifying as some of the stories leading up to it. I mentioned earlier the story of Timmy Bannerman, who is not a character in the book. He's kind of the focus of a story that Judd tells Lewis. Very, very, very scary, very unsettling. And you compare that story to the, how do I say this without ruining it? The brief storyline of Victor Pascal, which I think every film has done a phenomenal version of making that so grotesque and uncomfortable, and it just jumps off the page, and the images that I have in my head from watching those films definitely trump the images I came up with when I was actually reading the book. So there's definitely something to be said about that. But I find Victor Pascal to be obviously a very, very terrifying force, as well as Zelda, which is another character that the more I've watched the adaptations of the novel, the more I have understood how terrifying she is. Again, coming from more of an adult perspective, I can also kind of understand like Rachel's point of view and how terrifying that would have been through the eyes of a little girl. I feel like when I read this book again, I didn't quite have enough of a worldly understanding to get some of the core terrors. To me, I think Zelda was just like a creepy concept, but now looking at it, I see Zelda as this very tragic, awful, and uncomfortable figure plaguing Rachel's life that leads to a lot of the decisions that she may make in the book. And then obviously the entire storyline that focuses around Gage, which again, I'm not going to get into because I do not want to ruin this novel for you guys. I do find Gage's storyline to be extremely tragic, extremely disturbing, and just a truly depressing yet violent scene. And the more I think about it, the more I can understand how Stephen King viewed his own climax to the story as more horrific than Timmy Bannerman and Victor Pascal and Zelda. But when I initially read the books, I found those to be more solid, concrete concepts than the overarching storyline with Gage. One of the other things that I always found interesting about this story was the actual Pet Sematary itself. There's so much mystery shrouded upon the Pet Sematary that goes completely unanswered, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it actually elevates the story and gives it more depth. The Pet Sematary is part of the Micmac tribe burial grounds. We get the Indian burial grounds. And it is alluded, I believe, that it is controlled by a Wendigo. I find Wendigos to be extremely interesting. I know that they are characters from Native American folklore, and that you have to be very, very respectful with how you depict them. So I do think that Stephen King had that in mind by not really depicting the one involved in the story, but just kind of letting the reader know that its presence was there. I thought that was very, very well done. And just adds to this kind of like, again, creepy mystery around the Pet Sematary that us normal folk can't ever comprehend because it is supernatural forces so beyond us. Another thing that I always thought was funny is I've never been to Maine. When I read this book, I didn't really know birds too well, and there's like constant moments where they're all in the Pet Sematary and they hear loons, which is a type of bird. I didn't know that, so the whole time I thought it was like a weird like short term for lunatic, and it was just like a crazy person screaming in the woods, which was so terrifying to me. And then when I found out it was a bird later, I was like, oh, that's really not that scary, because I was just like, how come nobody ever spoke about the fact that there's like this crazy person just screaming in the woods? But yes, the atmosphere in Pet Sematary, I can say, is absolutely top notch. However, like I said again, my largest issue with Pet Sematary is the ending. I felt that there's so much laid out in this novel. There's so many terrifying scenes, and I was so dedicated to reading this book. And then I got like 4/5 of the way through, everything crazy started happening, and it just ended. And this to me has always been my first like true example of that that reputation that Stephen King has of not being able to stick his landings. I really, really felt that. I felt that again with The Stand. I find the ending to it, I'm not a fan of it, even though it's my favorite novel of all time. But those novels are so long and the journey is so worth it that the ending to me doesn't need to necessarily work because the journey was the adventure. Pet Sematary is much, much shorter. So I really wanted an expansion on what happens. And to me, that has always, again, been the biggest letdown of Pet Sematary. That I didn't find the climax as scary as some of the scenes that built up to it, and I just didn't love the ending, even though I don't think it's a bad ending. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it is the proper conclusion, but like Game of Thrones Season 8, it felt very, very, very rushed to me, and I felt like I wanted more explanation and more time with the actual events that were unfolding, and I felt like we didn't get that. And that has always been the biggest drawback for me for Pet Sematary. And now I'm totally going to go and watch Bloodlines because I'm like really excited to see how that movie is. I think it has like a 26% on Rotten Tomatoes or something, but oh well. Anyways, I hope this video helped you decide if you have ever wanted to read Pet Sematary, whether you should or should not, or if maybe you want to go back and revisit it, if you wanted to see what my opinions were, maybe you disagree with me, maybe you don't, I don't know. Let me know in the comments down below, whatever you guys think. As always, I try to post every Monday and Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like and subscribe button down below, and I will catch you on the next one. Mwah!